If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Our nation was founded on an ideal of freedom. We declared our independence with the words, "All men are created equal," and began our Constitution with the words, "We the people." For hundreds of years, the spirit of these words has inspired African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, women, and many other people to fight for their right to be included in this promise.
Our founders left out all women who were excluded from voting. They excluded all people of color from voting. And of course, they excluded white men who were not property owners from having a right to vote.
So which men do we believe were created equal? Does "we the people" really mean all of the people? When our founding fathers wrote about freedom and equality, most African Americans were slaves. And slaves weren't viewed as Americans at all. They weren't even considered people. They were defined as property.
Those founders were geniuses. They were brilliant men and really good men. And yet, when they wrote it, black people only counted as 3/5 of a person. They were allowed to be owned like animals. It's unimaginable today.
One slave who bravely imagined a different world, one in which he'd be a whole person, a real American, was Dred Scott. In the 1830s, the country was being ripped apart over slavery. Slavery was legal in some places and illegal in others. Dred Scott's master, John Emerson, took him from a slave state, Missouri, into Minnesota, where slavery was illegal. When Emerson died, Scott sued for his right to live as a free man. 11 long years later, the Supreme Court finally heard Scott's case and crushed his dreams of freedom. The court ruled that since Scott was a slave, he was not a citizen, he was private property, and had no right to sue for his freedom in federal court. They said that no one of African descent, even a free person, could ever be a citizen. And most damaging of all, they said that the federal government didn't even have the power to limit slavery in the first place, since the Constitution protected the right to own property. This decision overturned decades of hard-won compromise that had regulated slavery in the United States. Of course, it was also devastating to Dred Scott and all the country's African Americans. Many whites in the North were horrified by the court's words, and they were afraid that slave-owning Southerners would now take over Western lands where slavery had previously been illegal. They responded by electing our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln believed that slavery should not be allowed to expand outside of the states in which it already existed. When Lincoln won the presidency, it was the pro-slavery Southerners' turn to be horrified. Lincoln had only won the northern states. In many southern states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. Lincoln's victory upset some pro-slavery Southerners so badly that they decided to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America, where slavery would remain legal. When the Civil War broke out between the Union and Confederacy, Lincoln had to look for a way to keep the United States united. Lincoln hadn't always believed that African Americans deserved the same rights as white citizens. But as the war went on, he came to believe that we the people included African Americans too. Lincoln told Congress,
"In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve."
Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in Confederate-controlled territory. By the end of 1865, the Civil War was over, the North had won, and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution had abolished slavery in the United States. So now, former slaves were officially people. but they were a long way from enjoying all the freedoms that we the people are guaranteed.
Sometimes we think that the Civil War freed the slaves, that simply fighting it was the end of slavery. But because we are a nation of laws, it still took several acts of our government to end slavery, and not only to end slavery, but to also provide for equal protection and due process for all Americans.
Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 in an attempt to ensure citizenship for the freed slaves. But it wasn't quite enough. We needed another constitutional amendment, the 14th, to declare that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens, entitled to full civil rights. The addition of the 15th Amendment specifically protected every citizen's voting rights. But that was all more easily written than done.
States in the U.S. South who had just lost the Civil War were beginning to pass laws that made it difficult for newly freed people to actually be citizens.
After the devastation of the Civil War, the South was undergoing Reconstruction, and many Southerners still passionately believed that black and white citizens should not live as equals. Some believed that black people weren't qualified to vote. They stuffed ballot boxes with fake votes and cheated when reporting vote totals. Eventually, they even resorted to violence to keep African Americans from actually exercising their new rights.
1877, until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that is the whole period that we would think of as Jim Crow. Segregation in public transportation, segregation in public accommodations.
Jim Crow was a name from a popular song that mocked African Americans. It became the name for an era in which African Americans were officially citizens, but they could only exercise their rights separately from the white citizens. And separate isn't really so equal. In the meantime, some other Americans were also having a lot of trouble fitting into the we category.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Those words inscribed on the Statue of Liberty reflect another important American ideal, that the United States is a nation made from all kinds of people with all kinds of ideas and traditions, that immigrants are welcomed in America and offered a better life. But at times, this ideal has been difficult to uphold. While many African Americans were forced to come to America as slaves, many others have come here voluntarily from overseas, and yet have often been treated almost as badly.
We have a tidal wave of immigration, partly due to industrial expansion, especially into America's cities. Immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe in particular, and Chinese immigrants on the West Coast. So for the people that had already been here, this is stunning. Think of a really, really stuffy country club. That's kind of what America was before the great immigration waves.
By 1890, 8 out of every 10 people in New York City were either foreign-born or first-generation American. As our country grew, many hands were needed to build our cities and roads, to feed and clothe our communities. This labor was often performed by immigrants who came to pursue the American dream, but weren't actually able to live it themselves. Instead, their lives were often a nightmare of low-paying, dangerous factory jobs and substandard housing. The Chinese had it particularly rough. Many arrived in the 1850s to join the search for gold in California. But instead, by the 1860s, they were helping to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Some of the same people who benefited from Chinese labor became frightened of immigrants. They worried that if too many Chinese came, it would change the culture of the America that they knew. And working-class Californians resented having to compete with Chinese immigrants, who were often willing to work for lower wages. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned the immigration of additional Chinese laborers and kept the Chinese immigrants who were already here from becoming citizens. When our founding fathers found America, Native Americans had been happily living here for hundreds of years. But they weren't considered equal either. Some members of the U.S. government even considered them wild savages. For many years, every time America wanted elbow room, we the people elbowed Native Americans onto reservations, which usually weren't located on prime real estate. Some Native Americans decided it was their best bet to cooperate with the U.S. government, but others fought back in the Indian Wars on the Great Plains. There were many casualties on both sides. The worst may have been the killing of over 300 Sioux men, women, and children by U.S. cavalry forces at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. In 1880, a Native American named John Elk, who had been born on a U.S. reservation, tried to register to vote in Nebraska. Since he was born on U.S. soil, he was a citizen, right? Unfortunately not. Even though Elk considered himself American, the law didn't. The court said he owed his allegiance to the alien nation where he was born and denied him the right to vote in the country he called home. Eventually, the government was forced to reconsider the issue of Native American citizenship. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 looked like a step in the right direction. But there was a catch. To become U.S. citizens under the act, Native Americans would have to give up their tribal identities, only becoming American if they denied their own culture. Now, besides being denied the basic civil rights promised them in the Constitution, what do African Americans, immigrants, and Native Americans have in common? Well, about half of them are women. And women are noticeably missing from the phrase, "all men are created equal." During the years leading up to the Civil War, one woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, saw people fighting for the rights of African Americans, but only the men. She knew something had to be done. In 1848, Stanton helped organize the first Women's Rights Convention. They came away with a declaration of sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence that called for equal rights for women. But the Civil War interrupted their fight for equality, and it wasn't until the 1890s that women began to make real progress. They earned the right to inherit property and sign contracts. But it wasn't until 1920 that all American women were allowed to vote.
One of the important reasons to study history is because there are patterns that we see over and over again in a national story. I don't like the idea that history repeats itself, but certainly the more that we know our history, we might get clues from how we've failed or of how we've succeeded in the past.
The American celebration of liberty has not always been an equal one. But what can we, the people, do to ensure equal rights for all? Make sure to vote in each and every election. Vote for people who swear to uphold the Constitution for all Americans.
The real oath that the president swears is not to fix health care or even to fight off enemies. It is to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution. And the Constitution fundamentally says all Americans are equal.
We have to remember that the American story is always a story of struggle. It's always a story of people pushing to make America live up to her highest ideals.
Democracy will continue to march on, as long as Americans realize that we, the people, all need to march together equally.
And the pursuit of happiness.
Our nation was founded on an ideal of freedom. We declared our independence with the words, "all men are created equal," and began our Constitution with the words, "we the people."
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty.
If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time.
People. For hundreds of years, the spirit of these words has inspired African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, women, and many other people to fight for their right to be included in this promise.
Our founders left out all women, who who were excluded from voting. They excluded all people of color from voting. And of course, they excluded white men who were not property owners from having a right to vote.
So which men do we believe were created equal? Does we the people really mean all of the people? When our